When I was 20 years old, so 6 years ago, I worked as a delivery girl for a pretty popular pizzeria in my area. Initially, I worked the late morning to mid-afternoon shift, but when the guy who delivered for the night shift ended up getting fired for losing his license, I was placed on the night shift. I really didn't want that shift, because you never know if people who order late at night actually want a pizza, or if they have other intentions in mind. Unfortunately, my boss was an arsehole, and essentially told me that if I wasn't willing to take the night shift, I was fired. I wasn't exactly in a position where I could be out of work, albeit temporarily, so I reluctantly worked the shift. The first month of this shift went by without any issues. That is, until I had to deliver a pizza to a house that just barely made our delivery radius. I punched it into our GPS, and the house was located in a pretty suburban part of the city. I arrive, and it's about 11 PM. The block was extremely quiet, decently lit, and mostly littered with modern townhouses. The house I delivered to was a duplex. I ring the doorbell and wait for about 30 seconds. No answer. I ring it again and wait about another 30 seconds. Still, no answer. I'm standing there, getting pretty nervous that something's about to go down. But, thankfully, a man opens the door. He looked like he was in his late 40s. He was pretty tall, maybe a little over 6 foot, and he was very skinny. I tell him his pizza is here, and he just stands there, staring at me. I ask him if he's okay, and he responded by saying, "Yeah, I'm fine. Sorry. I got off work not too long ago, and I'm zoning out a bit." Fair enough, I suppose. He hands me the money. I hand him the pizza. And as I'm making change, he says, "You're really beautiful, you know that?" Not really thinking too much into it, I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his change. I said goodnight, and he did too. I walked back to my car and finished my deliveries for the night. A few days later, I get a delivery order to the same place. I head over there around the same time as last time, and again ring the doorbell. He answers the door very excitedly and said, "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" I told him I was tired and that I couldn't wait to go home, which he chuckled at. "I know that feeling pretty well," he said as he was pulling out his wallet. As he's counting his money, he asks what my name is. Being kinda tired at this point, and not really thinking too straight, I stupidly tell him my name. As I'm making change, he asks if he could have my number, as he'd, quote-unquote, love to hang out with someone as gorgeous as I am. Whoa, buddy, pump the brakes. I've literally only met this guy like twice to deliver a pizza. I had no idea who this guy was, and I'm positive he barely knew who I was as well. Another thing to mention is that I looked way younger than I was at the time. I was told by numerous people that I still looked about 15, and I was hoping that he thought differently, and wasn't hitting on me because he thought I was a teenager. I'm just standing there awkwardly for a few seconds, before I muster out, "Sorry, I have a boyfriend." He gets upset and says, "Oh, okay, I see." We stand there in silence before I tell him to have a good night and walk back to my car. He says nothing and still stands at the doorway, staring at me until he finally went back inside once I started my car. I got a pretty creepy vibe from this guy, and even brought it up with my co-workers. They agreed it was pretty creepy. They all agreed, that is, except for my boss, who overheard everything and claimed that I was just making up stories for sympathy. Fucking arsehole. A week later, I'm working the night shift, and we get an order from that same guy again. This is when shit really hits the fan. I arrive at the house around 10:30 PM. Keep in mind that from my perspective on the road, it didn't look like a single light in that house was on. I get out of my car and I walk up to the front door with the pizza box. As I'm approaching the door, it quickly swings open to reveal the man. Except this time, he was wearing a suit. I jumped back. He laughs and says, "Sorry if I scared you. I saw you out of the window and figured I'd just open the door now so you wouldn't have to ring the bell." I was getting scared because, as I mentioned before, there were no lights on in his house whatsoever. He was just sitting in the dark this whole time? If so, why? I nervously laugh and say it's okay. He asked me if I liked his suit, to which I said yes. He then asks me, "Would you like to go on a date with me tonight?" What the fuck? I once again tell him that I have a boyfriend, to which he chuckles, gets close to me, and says, "Honey, there's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship. If you go on a date with me, I'll show you how a real man treats a girl." He grabs the pizza box from me and throws it to the side. He then grabs me by my arms, hard. I'm officially shitting bricks at this point, and trying not to cry from the fear that was overwhelming me. I start pleading with him. "Dude, please, I just want to go home. I don't want to go on a date tonight." He just stares at me with the most sinister look I have ever seen on someone's face, and says, "I don't care. Get inside, now. We're gonna have a good time." He starts trying to pull me into his house, and I'm trying to resist as hard as I can. After a bit of struggling, he lets go of one of my arms. I did something that, to this day, I am thankful worked. I used my free arm to punch him as hard as I could in the stomach. This stuns him for a few seconds, and he loosens his grip on me, allowing me to break free. I quickly run to my car, and as I get in, he runs at me. I grab a half-empty bottle of soda I had in the cup holder and throw it. Luckily, it hits him in the head, and he lets go. I slam the door. I put the car in reverse and quickly back out of the spot, reversing down the road with him desperately trying to hold on. He's banging on my hood, screaming, "Stop the f***ing car!" I turn onto the next road as swiftly as possible, and luckily, he falls off the hood of my car. I slam the gas as hard as I could to get as far away from that sick bastard as possible. In my panicked state, I drove a couple of blocks down the street and kept making turn after turn onto other side blocks as I feared he was following me. Eventually, I reached a red light, and I slammed on the brakes and just sat there at the intersection, frozen from what had just happened. Once the light turned green, eventually I get the energy to drive back to the pizzeria, and almost immediately after I walk in, my coworker knew that something was wrong with me. My coworker comforted me, and my boss surprised me and began apologizing profusely for what had just happened and for putting me on the night shift. He takes me into the office and handed me the phone to call the cops. They arrive at the store, and I give them my statement and any scratches on my car. My coworker followed me as I drove home, and I collapsed on my bed. Strangely enough, I managed to fall asleep. I quit my job the next day, and luckily, a friend of mine managed to hook me up with a new job at her clothing store. As far as the psycho goes, 2 days later, I received an update from the police. The entire duplex was owned by the guy's brother, who lived on the right side with his wife. The psycho lived on the left side of the duplex. I learned that he had been in and out of jail constantly, at first for robberies and assaults, but later on. He had been released from jail for about 5 months before this encounter. When the cops arrived at the house, he was long gone, and his family had no idea where he had run off to. The police insisted that they would find him. Indeed, they did. Apparently, the guy had fled to a nearby city and attempted to kidnap a teenager walking alone late at night on the street. Luckily, somebody happened to be looking out their window at the right time. They called the cops, and the police caught him trying to force her into his car. I thanked the officers for everything they had done and for informing me, and I walked out of the station. I walked down the street and light up a cigarette, taking in everything I had just been told. I felt relieved that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. I was relieved that I would never have to encounter him again and reliving what had happened that night. My last experience 2 years before this was scary, but I think this one takes the cake as being the scariest, as I was alone and face to face with a psycho. Who knows where I'd be if he managed to pull me inside that house.